The Tale of the Four Elemental Crystals of Light. It's a story that has come to be known as cliched in our time, but have you ever considered where it originated? Final Fantasy for the Famicom first introduced me to this concept in the form of a video game, where the theme of the crystals almost became unanimously associated with the Final Fantasy franchise. The third game in the series, Final Fantasy III, is no different. This review, however, will cover the 3D remake that first appeared on the Nintendo DS. Developed by Matrix Software and published by Square Enix, Final Fantasy III 3D Remake has appeared on various platforms over its lifetime. For the purposes of this review, I played the version that appears on Steam. In the Americas, it is sometimes possible to be confused when someone mentions Final Fantasy III. First appearing in NTSC territories on the Super Nintendo in 1994, that Final Fantasy III is actually Final Fantasy VI. Initially, Western countries never saw the original Final Fantasy III on native systems, at least not until it was remade and released in 3D on the Nintendo DS in 2006. The 3D version takes the original nameable, mute characters and gives them personality, backstories, and names which are unique to this version of the game. Whilst everyone is currently out there playing the Pixel Remaster, I wanted to delve into the 3D remake, which delivers a unique experience standing aside from its siblings. We are placed into the shoes of Luneth, a young boy from the village of and as young children are wont to do, he gets lost when exploring, loses his footing, and falls into Altar Cave. After navigating his way through the labyrinthine network, he stumbles upon the Crystal of Wind that tells him that he has been chosen, and he needs to return there when he has assembled the other Warriors of Light. After making it back to his village, he sets forth on an adventure joined by his childhood friend Ark. Along the way they meet Refia and Ingus, completing their 4 Heroes of Light party. After solving the mystery of why people in nearby villages have become wandering spirits, and lifting the curse of the Jinn, the 4 return to the Crystal of Wind, which bestows them with the last of its radiant light. One thing that I do want to mention that irked me was that even though the characters are given names and personalities this time around, there never seemed to be that much depth to them. The story was basic, simple, and whenever a character sacrifice occurred, there was never any meaning to it because it was all brushed off and forgotten about within a couple of minutes. I never really found myself caring about anything that happened in the game, and recently wondered why, coming to the conclusion that you are never in an area long enough, and you never return to previous areas, so throughout the whole journey it never felt like any of it mattered, if you get what I mean. If you intend to play this game for the story, then you should probably temper your expectations and go in not expecting anything fabulous, so that you don't come away disappointed like I did. Rather than story, the focus of Final Fantasy III is more on its gameplay and job system. Similar in nature to the first Final Fantasy III allows you to choose what role each of your characters play. Whilst initially each character begins as a freelancer, once you receive your first lot of jobs, you can freely change your character's roles at any time, outside of battle. The Crystal of Wind imparts the Warrior, Thief, Black Mage, White Mage, Red Mage, and Monk jobs, which echoes the beginning jobs that the first Final Fantasy presents you with. I thought that this was a nice touch. As you progress and find the other crystals in the world, your party will gain other jobs that they can then use to help you throughout the adventure. The job system is an important element for getting through the game. Each job starts at level 1 for each character and will gain job points through the process of participation in battle. Whilst these job levels are independent of a character level and don't at first appear as though they affect much, you'll come to realise that as you increase the job level, the unique job ability for that job will become more effective. For example, the Geomancer's Terrain ability will increase in potency the higher the level it is, which technically means that any job is viable and won't be superseded by those you may find later. Additionally, if you manage to get a job to level 99, you receive a certificate and a job-specific item from a character that forms part of one of the game's later side quests. One thing that I should note though is that it's not possible to keep all characters on one specific job throughout the whole game, due to mechanics in certain dungeons that bar your progress or make your life difficult if you're not using an appropriate job for the situation. For example, If you don't use Dragoons against a boss in Saronia, you'll probably be unable to defeat it unless you are severely overleveled, and who really has time for that? In addition to the 4 main characters, sometimes guest characters may also join the party. This serves 2 functions. First, it allows the ability to have a conversation with them at any time in the field by pressing X on an Xbox controller, which acts as a camp where you can gain additional information about the current location or events. I liked this aspect of the game and was disappointed that it was only possible to participate in if you had a guest character in the party. I'd have liked to have seen interactions between the core party in the absence of these guests, especially at times in the narrative where you may be lost. The other thing that can happen when a guest character is in tow is that they may enter battle like a summon to hurt the enemy or buff your party, though this is random, kind of like Gilgamesh or Odin in Final Fantasy VIII. It doesn't really do much if you're fighting against a boss, but sometimes it was nice against normal enemies to have that little bit of extra damage or a free heal that didn't cost you any MP. Equipment and spells must be either bought from town or found in chests in dungeons. In the case of magic, there are 8 levels of spells and each character can only equip 3 spells of each level at a time across black magic, white magic and summons. They can also only use this magic if their class is related to magic use. If you assign a spell to someone and then decide that they don't need it, it is possible to transfer that same spell to someone else, so you don't need to discard it. In regard to equipment, all characters can dual wield, and in most cases it's the most sensible thing to do. Additionally, some equipment can be used as an item in battle, such as the fire rod, allowing you to cast the fire spell. This is incredibly useful for saving MP early in the game, and should not be underestimated. Especially so because rather than a bountiful MP pool, each character has a set number of spells that they can cast per level, based on their experience, similar to the original Final Fantasy. Battles take place on a separate screen and are random encounters that pit you up against up to 3 adversaries at a time. The battlefield will see your party lined up on the right with the enemy party on the left, though the camera is dynamic so these angles are not set. Battles are turn-based and you will be required to select each character's action prior to it being executed. For some reason though, a character's speed doesn't seem to matter all that much, as sometimes I found that my white mage would cast a healing spell before the enemy, and other times after, with no rhyme or reason. Characters' abilities are derived from the job that they are currently assigned, and there is no mix and matching of abilities at all. For example, the Dragoon can only use jump to attack from the air, removing themselves as a target for that round, whereas a black mage can only use black magic and a white mage white magic. It is essential to travel with a balanced party as the game can become very unforgiving at times. If you change your job, you will incur a penalty that demerits a character's stats for a certain number of battles. I never found this to be too debilitating, but I thought I should mention it. Also, when traveling through a dungeon, there are no save points anywhere, and you cannot just save from the menu like you could in the PSP version of Final Fantasy II. The only place you can save is the world map, so you'd better be sure that your party is prepared to face whatever lies at the end of a dungeon. There were a couple of times where I was underprepared and paid the price. Typically the boss battle won't start until you actually go up and talk to it, however there are some occasions where it will commence upon entering the room that it's inhabiting, so it pays to be careful. Generally speaking, I found most dungeons I ended up doing 2 runs, one to get all the treasures and the second to go and fight the boss. This usually ensured that my character and job levels were sufficient to take on whatever was lurking in the darkness. When exploring dungeons, there may come a time where the way seems barred and progress impossible. In such situations, if you press the left bumper, LB, you can zoom in to see everything up close. Sometimes this will allow you to see small motes of sparkling light, which when interacted with act as switches to open doors. This can also be done in towns to find items that would normally be invisible to the naked eye. In concept, I did like this idea, but it was so rarely used toward the end of the game that it seemed more of a novelty than an actual game function. Plus, usually you can interact with the various switches without having to zoom in if you're a thorough explorer. Also, some spells do sometimes serve a purpose outside a battle, such as Toad and Minnie being necessary to be able to progress through some areas, which was a nice way to put magic to practical use in the field. Although again, whilst I liked this in theory, in some cases it ended up being more frustrating than anything, especially in areas where you must remain in small form, which means you have to rely on magic users to get through the battles. Regarding side content, there isn't really all that much on offer. Everything additional can be done prior to beating the game with no post-game content. There are a couple of extra dungeons which are almost necessary to complete in order to be of a high enough level to tackle some of the later areas of the game, but the only thing that they offer are additional treasures and experience. There is also the Mog Mail System, whereby depending on which character you have in the lead position when talking to a Moogle in town, will allow you to receive mail from an NPC related to that character. Sometimes the letters will be a hint or request for assistance. At such times, if you return to the person who sent the letter and help them, you may get a new job or a special weapon. These quests aren't long and are simple, so I wouldn't expect too much. I play a lot of Final Fantasy XIV, and the producers of that game have often cited Final Fantasy III as being one of their favourites and inspiration for that game, and I can see where they drew some of their concepts. However, I am not sure, other than nostalgia, why Final Fantasy III is so treasured. I mean, I love that the final dungeon of Final Fantasy III was turned into a raid series in Final Fantasy XIV, and Shadowbringers also heavily drew from the lore, in that 1000 years prior, in Final Fantasy III, a flood of light was prevented by the Warriors of Darkness. But other than some of the concepts, the story of Final Fantasy III never really goes anywhere unique or unexpected. It's always just go from place A to place B, sometimes via C, and don't forget the D, whilst helping the people you meet along the way. I don't typically tend to mind this, as it's a general RPG formula, but Final Fantasy III is so bare bones in the way that it takes on this narrative device, that there was never anything that kept me wanting more. None of the characters even really stood out as being memorable either. And don't get me started on the amount of grinding that's necessary to be able to progress in some places. There is such a high barrier to entry in some areas that you need to grind for 5 or more levels to be able to even stand a chance, not to mention the fact that bosses get stronger the less health they have, and can cheap shot your entire party when they are near death. Graphically speaking, the game isn't a masterpiece, which Square Enix is typically known for, but it also isn't ugly by any means, unless you consider some of the monster designs that could be the stuff of nightmares. Going from the DS to the PC, I think some of the 3D art is cleaner and less jagged, but the way that the characters are depicted as having super tiny deformed arms and legs compared to the rest of their body proportions is something that I've not really been able to get used to, even in other games that use the same design aesthetic. Most of the villages that you travel through look identical and don't have unique themes to them to differentiate their cultures and customs, which I found a little disappointing. The CGI movie at the start of the game, on the other hand, is beautiful, so I do have to give kudos there. The music of the game is fitting, but I wouldn't say that it blew my mind either. Of course, there are some memorable tracks, but most of the time the music was just there. A lot of the tracks are also short, being under a minute in length or just over, which means that they don't really get a good chance to get good before they are looping back on themselves. My favourite track is called Forbidden Land Eureka, which has a subtle choir in the background spurring you on to fight ever more difficult enemies in your pursuit of the powerful sealed weapons contained within the lands of Eureka. Sadly, Final Fantasy III is a bit of a wet fish for me. Whilst it does have some good concepts and ideas, the execution of them fell a bit flat and left me feeling tired after all the grinding that it expected me to do. The job system was a good step in the right direction, slowing the shackles of the limitations that jobs had in the first Final Fantasy, but there is more room to grow, which we will see in later games like Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy Tactics, and even Final Fantasy XIV. And whilst the story of the quest for the crystals is not a new one, Final Fantasy III approaches it a little differently, providing a narrative that separates itself from the first game in the series, but I'm not sure whether it is one that would be enjoyable to everyone. If you are looking to try out this game, I would definitely recommend going in with tempered expectations. By the way, the Nintendo DS had a lot of great games in its time, some better than this one. What are some of your favourites? Let me know in the comments. This has been Venoir with a review of Final Fantasy III 3D Remake for Steam on PC. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe for more great JRPG content. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye bye for now!